Before we step into the gas-lit ballrooms of 1875 London and unravel this tale of hidden desires and mistaken hearts, please take a moment to support our channel. If you enjoy stories of romance, secrets, and the kind of longing that changes destinies, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us bring more of these emotional journeys to life for you. Now, let us return to a spring that promised to be unlike any other. The spring of 1875 arrived in London with a peculiar, humid warmth, a heavy atmosphere that seemed to press against the window panes of Mayfair and whisper of impending transformation. However, for Lady Imogen Carlisle, the concept of transformation was a fairy tale, reserved for debutantes with larger dowries and louder laughs. At the advanced age of 23, Imogen had long since calcified into her role within the complex, rigid hierarchy of London society. She was the sensible one, the pleasant one, the young woman who could be relied upon to hold a fan, listen to an elderly aunt's complaints about gout, and fill an empty seat at a dinner table without ever drawing attention to herself. She was, in the brutal parlance of the ton, furniture. Her father, the Earl of Carlisle, was a man who possessed an ancient title that dated back to the Tudors, but a fortune that had been slowly eroded by generations of bad investments and good brandy. He had enough standing to secure invitations to every notable event of the season, yet lacked the financial magnetism to make his only daughter a true matrimonial prize. Imogen knew this reality intimately. She had observed it for 4 seasons, watching from the sidelines as girls with half her intelligence but twice her fortune were swept onto the dance floor and into advantageous marriages. As she stood before the mirror in her bedchamber, her lady's maid, Martha, fastened the final pearl button of her cream silk gown. It was a beautiful dress, tasteful and refined, chosen by her late mother years ago. But Imogen knew the truth about beauty in their world. It only mattered if someone bothered to look. Martha, fiercely loyal and perpetually optimistic, chided her mistress's lack of enthusiasm, calling her as lovely as a spring morning. Imogen merely offered a wan, practiced smile. She knew she was pretty enough in a quiet, unassuming way, chestnut hair that refused to curl fashionably, eyes the color of weak tea, and a demeanor that screamed competent rather than captivating. She was clever enough to converse on politics and art, but not witty enough to sparkle, well-bred enough to belong, but not remarkable enough to be remembered. The Ashworth ball that evening promised to be the usual affair, a suffocating crush of bodies in an overheated ballroom, the air thick with the scent of beeswax, expensive perfume, and desperate ambition. For Imogen, these events had become an exercise in anthropological detachment. She was not a participant, she was an observer of the theatre of courtship. As she descended the grand staircase of Ashworth House on her father's arm, the Earl patted her hand with a distracted affection, offering the same hollow encouragement he offered every year. "Chin up, my dear, perhaps this will be your season." The conviction in his voice had evaporated years ago, replaced by a rote habit. The ballroom glittered with the light of 500 candles, their flames reflecting off the diamonds of dowagers and the polished floors that would soon be scuffed by satin slippers. The air thrummed with the scraping of violin strings tuning up, the ripple of polite laughter, and the underlying electric current of the marriage market. Imogen immediately retreated to her preferred territory near the refreshment tables, a strategic vantage point that offered a clear view of the floor, while keeping her largely invisible behind the potted palms. She began her usual mental cataloguing, the season's debutantes, fresh-faced 17-year-olds in white muslin, looking terrified and hopeful, the eligible gentlemen circling them like well-dressed sharks, calculating dowries and bloodlines with predatory precision. It was a monotonous, predictable ecosystem until Lady Beatrice Thornton approached. Beatrice, one of the few women of high standing who still acknowledged Imogen's existence, possessed the casual cruelty of the truly beautiful. After a brief, backhanded compliment about Imogen's dress washing her out, Beatrice dropped the piece of information that would, unknowingly, set the wheels of fate in motion. The Montlair brothers were in attendance. The name sent a ripple through the room that Imogen could physically feel, a sudden sharpening of attention among the mothers and a collective intake of breath among the daughters. The Montlair family was apex predators in this social jungle. The Duke of Blackthorn, Hugh Montlair, was a figure of immense wealth and even greater remoteness, a man who rarely deigned to descend from his ancestral seat to mingle with mere mortals. His younger brother Christopher, known universally as Kit, was his polar opposite, the darling of the tabloids and the dream of every debutante, for both to be at the Ashworth ball was unprecedented. Imogen's pulse, usually a steady, sensible rhythm, quickened involuntarily. She had seen the Duke precisely 3 times in as many years, and each time he had struck her as a figure carved from granite, tall, severe, and radiating an air of barely restrained impatience with the frivolities of the ton. Following Beatrice's gaze to the entrance, Imogen saw them. They stood in stark contrast, a study in light and shadow. The elder, undoubtedly Hugh, surveyed the room not with interest but with the grim assessment of a general surveying a battlefield he intended to level. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his evening clothes with a careless perfection that suggested he had been born in white tie. His face was a mask of cold boredom, his eyes grey and glacial, tracking escape routes rather than potential partners. Beside him stood Kit, radiant and golden. Where Hugh was sharp angles and restrained power, Kit was easy charm and fluid grace. He was laughing at something the major domo had said, his smile bright enough to outshine the chandelier overhead. Kit embodied everything society loved: approachability wrapped in aristocratic breeding, a second son with a massive settlement from his mother, and no responsibilities other than the pursuit of pleasure. Imogen watched from her safe obscurity as Kit's gaze began to sweep the ballroom. He paused, here and there offering a nod or a smile, his eyes dancing with appreciation for the spectacle. And then the impossible happened. His eyes stopped. They didn't land on the diamond of the season, nor the daughter of a marquis in the center of the floor. They landed on the potted palm, and then unmistakably on Imogen. She froze, certain he was looking at someone behind her. She looked away immediately, heat rising in her cheeks, a reflex of self-preservation honed over years of avoiding mockery. But when she dared to glance back, Kit Montlair was still watching her. More than that, he was smiling. Not a polite social grimace, but a genuine, delighted smile, as if he had just discovered a rare book in a dusty library. Before Imogen could process the absurdity of the moment, Kit was moving. He cut through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who has never known rejection, parting the sea of colourful gowns and black coats. Hugh remained by the entrance. Imogen noted, with a shiver she couldn't explain, that the Duke's expression had darkened. His eyes, cold and sharp as winter rain, tracked his brother's progress with an intensity that bordered on anger. But Kit was already there, standing before her, bowing low. His voice was warm, rich with genuine pleasure, as he greeted her by name. He didn't ask about the weather or the music. Instead, he launched immediately into a conversation that felt bizarrely intimate, referencing a comment she had supposedly made about the painter Turner's later works. Imogen was baffled. She had never spoken to Christopher Montlair in her life, but his charm was a physical force, sweeping aside her confusion. He claimed to be educating himself on modern art and begged for her opinion, framing it not as small talk, but as a plea from an ignorant soul to an expert. It was a masterstroke of social engineering. By asking for her intellect rather than paying a compliment to her appearance, he disarmed her defenses. Imogen found herself responding, her voice steadying as she spoke of Turner's use of light, of the luminosity that transcended representation. Kit listened with rapt attention, or a perfect simulation of it, his blue eyes fixed on her face. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The wallflower was speaking to the golden boy, and the golden boy was hanging on her every word. When he asked for the next dance, a waltz no less, Imogen felt a wave of dizziness. To dance with Hugh Montlair was to step into the spotlight, to be dragged from the shadows and placed on a pedestal for all of London to critique. Yet, looking into his open, friendly face, she couldn't bring herself to refuse. As Kit led her onto the floor, the sensation of being watched intensified until it was almost a physical weight, pressing between her shoulder blades. Imogen couldn't resist. As she took her place opposite Kit, she cast a glance back toward the entrance. Hugh Montlair had not moved, but his posture had shifted. He was no longer leaning casually against the doorframe. He was standing rigid, his entire body a line of tension. His grey eyes were locked on them, locked on her, with a scrutiny that was terrifying in its focus. It wasn't the appreciative gaze of his brother. It was a piercing, analytical stare that seemed to strip away the silk and the social pleasantries to see the marrow of who she was. It made her breath catch in her throat, a sudden, sharp intake of air that had nothing to do with the exertion of the dance. The music swelled, and Kit swept her into the waltz. He was a magnificent dancer, light on his feet and firm in his guidance, chatting effortlessly as they spun. He spoke of his brother's brooding nature, dismissing Hugh's terrifying demeanor as a deliberate cultivation to keep the world at arm's length. He laughed about their father's legacy and Hugh's obsession with duty. Imogen answered. She smiled. She played her part in this unexpected fairy tale. The court was watching, the whispers were starting, and for the first time in her life, she was the envy of the room. Kit made her feel charming, he made her feel interesting, he made her feel visible. But even as she laughed at Kit's witticisms, even as she allowed herself to enjoy the warmth of his hand on her waist and the envious glares of the debutantes, Imogen could not shake the feeling of the Duke's eyes. Every time the rotation of the waltz brought her explicitly into Hugh's line of sight, she felt a jolt, like touching a live wire. It was a dark, heavy counterweight to Kit's brightness. Kit was the sun, warming and blinding, but Hugh was the gravity that kept the earth in orbit, unseen, silent, and overwhelmingly powerful. The dance continued, a dizzying blur of motion and color, but the true drama was not in the steps or the music. It was in the triangulation of three souls, the charming adventurer who had finally noticed the wallflower who was terrified to believe in her own luck, and the silent, brooding brother watching from the shadows, his stillness screaming louder than any words. As the final notes of the waltz decayed into the air, Imogen realized, with a shiver of premonition, that the safety of her invisible life was gone. She had been seen, truly seen, and there would be no going back to the shadows now. The morning following the Ashworth ball dawned with a deceptive normalcy over London, the grey skies offering no hint of the seismic shift that had occurred in the quiet life of Lady Imogen Carlisle. However, inside the faded grandeur of Carlisle house, the atmosphere vibrated with a nervous anticipation that was entirely foreign to its inhabitants. For the first time in 4 years, Imogen did not sit in the morning room resigned to her needlepoint and the ticking of the mantel clock. Instead, she found herself unable to settle, her eyes repeatedly drawn to the window that overlooked the street, watching for a carriage, a rider, a sign that the events of the previous night had not been a fever dream conjured by a desperate imagination. The memory of the waltz with Christopher Montlair still lingered in her muscles. a phantom sensation of being spun through light and sound, but darker and more persistent was the memory of the Duke of Blackthorn's gaze, a weight that had followed her home and settled into the corners of her mind. When the arrival finally came, it was not merely a polite call, it was a declaration. Christopher, Kit, did not simply knock. He arrived as if heralding the spring itself. He brought with him an energy that seemed to displace the dusty, stagnant air of the drawing room, filling it with oxygen and light. But it was not just his presence that marked the occasion. It was the roses. He carried an armful of white roses, dozens of them, their petals pristine and unfurling, a gesture so extravagant and theatrical that it bordered on the absurd. Yet, in the hands of Kit Montlair, it felt like a charming excess rather than a vulgar display. He presented them not with the stiff formality of a suitor checking a box, but with a laughing apology for monopolizing her time the previous evening, claiming that his selfishness required a floral penance. The hours that followed were a revelation to Imogen, as they sat in the drawing room, chaperoned by a dozing aunt in the corner. Kit peeled back the edges of the world she had never seen. He did not speak of London gossip or the tedious politics of the peerage. He spoke of Italy, of the golden light hitting the ruins of Rome, of the blue waters of the Aegean, and the chaotic vibrancy of Cairo markets. He painted pictures with words, offering Imogen a glimpse of a life lived in technicolor, far removed from the beige existence of a London wallflower. For Imogen, who had lived her entire life within the safe, suffocating confines of propriety, Kit represented the ultimate seduction. Escape. He listened to her too, with that same intense focus he had displayed at the ball, asking about her, reading her thoughts on the changing seasons, making her feel that her quiet observations were not dull, but profound. However, the easy rhythm of their exchange was shattered by a second arrival, one that no one had anticipated. The announcement from the butler was hesitant, as if he himself could barely believe the name he was speaking. The Duke of Blackthorn. The atmosphere in the drawing room shifted instantly, the temperature dropping as if a window had been thrown open to a winter gale. Kit's easy smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine surprise and something darker, perhaps annoyance, crossing his handsome features before he smoothed it back into his habitual charm. Imogen's heart, which had been fluttering with the pleasure of Kit's attention, now slammed against her ribs with a heavy, ominous thud. The Duke did not make morning calls. He did not visit impoverished earls' daughters. His presence was an anomaly, a disruption of the natural order. Hugh Montlair entered the room not with his brothers. Sunlight, but with the inevitable force of a coming storm. He was dressed for riding, his boots polished to a mirror shine, his coat tailoring, emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders. He seemed too large for the room, his presence absorbing the available light. He offered a curt, precise bow, his grey eyes sweeping the scene with a critical efficiency, taking in the extravagant roses, Kit's relaxed posture, and finally Imogen's flushed face. He claimed with a voice that rumbled like distant thunder that he was there to return a book borrowed by her father months ago. It was a transparent fabrication. The book in his hand looked as though it had been pulled from a shelf at random. Moments before, the air crackled with the unspoken truth. He was not here for literature, he was here for surveillance. The dynamic in the room transformed into a tense triangle. Kit attempted to maintain the light-hearted mood, joking about Hugh's sudden interest in social calls, but Hugh did not smile. He ignored his brother's banter, turning his attention fully to Imogen. It was an interrogation disguised as conversation. He saw the book of art prints on the table, a volume on J.M.W. Turner that Kit and Imogen had ostensibly been discussing, and the subject turned to art. But where Kit had nodded and smiled at Imogen's opinions, Hugh challenged them. He picked up the book, his large, gloved hands handling the pages with surprising delicacy, and questioned her assessment of Turner's later more chaotic works. It was not a polite exchange. Hugh argued that Turner's abstraction was a descent into madness, a loss of form. Imogen, finding a sudden inexplicable courage beneath the weight of his scrutiny, argued back. She spoke of the emotion, of the colour, the truth of the feeling rather than the accuracy of the line. For the first time she forgot she was a wallflower speaking to a duke. She forgot her place. She argued with passion, defending the beauty of the indistinct, the power of the storm. And as she spoke, she saw something shift in Hugh's glacial eyes. The boredom. Vanished, replaced by a sharp, piercing intelligence. He wasn't dismissing her, he was engaging with her. It was a combat of minds, stripped of flirtation, raw and intellectual. For 5 minutes, the rest of the room ceased to exist. It was just Imogen and Hugh, locking horns over the nature of beauty and truth. The intensity of the moment was broken by Kit, who stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The golden boy did not like being relegated to the shadows. He interjected, steering the conversation back to safer, shallower waters. Plans for a picnic, the social calendar, the weather. The connection between Imogen and Hugh snapped, but the energy remained humming in the air like the aftermath of a lightning strike. Hugh stepped back, his mask of indifference sliding back into place, but the way he looked at Imogen had changed. It was no longer just analysis, it was recognition. He had looked for a vapid girl entertained by his brother's charm, and he had found a woman who could meet him on the battlefield. Of ideas, the departure of the brothers was as awkward as it was inevitable. Kit lingered over his farewell, kissing Imogen's hand with a promise to return the next day, playing the role of the devoted suitor to perfection. Hugh offered only a stiff nod, his expression unreadable, yet his gaze lingered on her for a second longer than propriety. A loud, a silent communication that unsettled her to her core. As they moved into the hallway, Imogen sank back onto the settee, her mind reeling. She felt exhausted, as if she had run a mile, yet her blood sang with an unfamiliar vitality. She had been courted by one brother and challenged by the other, and she was no longer sure which. Interaction had left her more breathless, but the true revelation of the afternoon came not in the drawing room, but a moment later. Realizing Kit had left his gloves on the side table, a deliberate oversight perhaps, to ensure a reason to return, Imogen grabbed them and hurried into the hallway, intending to catch them before they exited the front door. She stopped dead before turning the corner. The front door was open, and the brothers were standing on the steps, their voices drifting back into the quiet house. They thought they were out of earshot. They were wrong. The tone of the conversation froze Imogen in place. Gone was Kit's laughter. Gone was Hugh's cold silence. In their place was the heated, urgent friction of a long-standing conflict. Imogen heard Kit's voice, sharp and defensive, accusing Hugh of interference, of suffocating him, of being unable to stand seeing him happy. And then came Hugh's reply, low and vibrating with a suppressed fury that frightened her more than shouting would have. He wasn't talking about happiness. He was talking about responsibility. He accused Kit of recklessness, of playing a game with a life that wasn't his to toy with. He called the courtship a whim, a temporary fascination that would end in wreckage. Imogen pressed herself against the wall, the gloves clutched tightly in her hand, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. Against her ribs, she heard Hugh say the words that would haunt her, that Kit didn't know what he was doing, that he would break her, and that she, Imogen, deserved better than to be an experiment in domesticity for a man who had never stayed in one place for more than a season. It was a brutal assessment, stripping away the romance of the morning to reveal the cynical fears beneath. But what struck Imogen most was not the warning about Kit. It was the raw, desperate edge in Hugh's voice, when he spoke of her deserving better. It sounded personal. It sounded like a man who was not protecting a stranger's virtue, but defending something precious to himself. The brothers descended the steps, their argument unsettled, leaving a silence in the hallway that felt heavy with unspoken threats. Imogen retreated into the shadows of the house, the gloves still in her hand, the white roses in the drawing room suddenly looking less like a promise of spring and more like a peace offering for a war she hadn't known she was fighting. She realized then that she was not merely being courted. She was the battleground in a war between two men who saw her in fundamentally different ways. Kit saw a mirror for his own desire to be good. Hugh saw a reality that terrified him. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, locking the world out, Imogen understood that the danger was no longer just about being overlooked. The danger now was in being the focal point of a collision between duty and desire, and she had no idea which brother would survive the impact. The weeks that followed the confrontation at Carlisle House did not bring the clarity Imogen had desperately hoped for. Instead, they brought a whirlwind that threatened to uproot the very foundations of her existence. London society, a beast that usually slumbered until the next scandal, awoke with a ravenous hunger for the developing drama involving the Montlair brothers and the Earl of Carlisle's unassuming daughter. What began as a ripple of curiosity transformed into a tidal wave of speculation. Mr. Montlair and Lady Imogen became a fixed phrase in the lexicon of the ton, uttered over tea trays and behind fluttering fans in every drawing room from Mayfair to Belgravia. The novelty of the match was its primary fuel. The golden, adventurous second son of a duke, courting a woman who had, for 3 seasons, blended seamlessly into the wallpaper. It was a Cinderella story, devoid of a wicked stepmother, but filled with enough ambiguity to keep the gossips fed for a month. Imogen found herself at the center of a social storm she was ill-equipped to navigate. Invitations that had previously trickled in now arrived in torrents, silver trays piled high with cream-colored cards requesting her presence at breakfasts, garden parties, and musical evenings. Yet amidst this sudden popularity, Imogen felt a profound sense of dislocation. She was no longer walking through the season as an observer. She was the performance, and every performance requires an audience. While Kit played the role of the attentive suitor with an ease that suggested he had rehearsed it all his life, remembering her favorite flowers, learning her preferences for Chopin over Mozart, charming her father into a state of perpetual beaming, there was another presence that haunted the periphery of her vision. The Duke of Blackthorn. Hugh Montlair became a ghost at the feast. Where Kit was, Hugh was never far behind. It was a deviation from his established pattern of reclusive behavior so severe that it alone would have caused talk had the society matrons not been so focused on his brother's romance. Hugh did not approach Imogen. He did not bring flowers or make charming conversation about Italian ruins. He simply existed in the same space, a dark, gravitational anomaly that pulled at Imogen's attention, no matter how hard she tried to focus on Kit. At the Peyton musical evening, she felt the weight of his gaze from across the room, a physical sensation like a touch on the nape of her neck. When she turned, he was there, leaning against a pillar, his face a mask of stone, yet his eyes burning with an intensity that made the breath catch in her throat. He was not watching the musicians. He was watching her laugh at something Kit had whispered. It was not the look of a future brother-in-law approving a match. It was the look of a man witnessing a theft. The tension fermented, thick and intoxicating, until it finally broke at the Duchess of Marlborough's ball, the premiere event of the mid-season. Imogen arrived in a gown of deep sapphire silk, a bold departure from her usual pastels, chosen perhaps in a subconscious bid to match the new, dangerous rhythm of her life. The color transformed her, lending a depth to her eyes and a glow to her skin that made her look less like a wallflower and more like a woman. With secrets, Kit found her immediately, his appreciation vocal and public. He claimed her attention with a possessiveness that thrilled the onlookers, guiding her through the room as if she were a prize he had already won. He spoke of the future in vague, glittering terms, trips to Scotland, house parties in the autumn, weaving a net of promises. That felt soft and comforting, but comfort is rarely the precursor to transformation. As the orchestra struck up the opening notes of a waltz, Kit prepared to lead her onto the floor, his smile bright and assured. Then a shadow fell across them. Hugh Montlair materialized from the crowd, cutting through the perimeter of admirers like a blade. He did not smile. He did not offer the polite pleasantries that greased the wheels of social interaction. He simply stated, with a voice that cut through the ambient chatter, that he believed Lady Imogen had promised him a dance. It was a lie. Imogen knew it, Kit knew it, and Hugh certainly knew it. The sheer audacity of the claim froze the immediate vicinity. For a heartbeat, the brothers stood locked in a silent stare down, the air between them crackling with the same electricity Imogen had witnessed on her doorstep weeks ago. Kit's easy charm faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine annoyance, but the social contract of the ballroom forbade a scene. With a tight jaw and a forced nod, Kit stepped back, relinquishing his claim. Imogen placed her hand in Hugh's. If Kit's touch was warm sunlight, Hugh's was a jolt of static electricity, sudden, sharp, and undeniable. He led her onto the floor, not with his brother's fluid grace, but with a commanding power. As he turned her into the dance, his hand settled on her waist, firm and possessive, pulling her arguably closer than propriety dictated. They moved in silence for the first turn, the physical proximity overwhelming Imogen's senses. She could smell the scent of sandalwood and starch, could feel the heat radiating from his chest through the layers of her dress. It was terrifying, it was exhilarating. When Hugh finally spoke, his voice was pitched low, meant for her ears alone, vibrating through the small space between them. He did not waste time on compliments. He went straight to the wound. He observed that she had been spending a great deal of time with his brother, his tone turning the observation into an accusation. Imogen, emboldened by the sapphire dress, and the adrenaline coursing through her veins, countered that Kit had been kind. The word kind seemed to twist something in Hugh's expression, a flicker of pain or perhaps distaste. He asked if that was what she called it, kindness. He called it recklessness. He called it a game. The waltz spun them around the perimeter of the room, a swirl of color and light, but Imogen saw only grey eyes. Hugh launched into a dissection of his brother's character that was as clinical as it was brutal. He spoke of Christopher's history, of a trail of abandoned hobbies and temporary passions. He described a man who collected experiences like souvenirs, who loved the beginning of things, the chase, the novelty, the first flush of romance, but who lacked the constitution for the endurance required by reality. He wasn't telling her this to be cruel, though the words stung like a lash. He was presenting a dossier of facts, warning her that she was currently the novelty, and that novelties inevitably lost their shine. Imogen fought back. She defended Kit, but her defense was fragile, built on the hope of what she wanted to be true, rather than the certainty of what she knew. She accused Hugh of jealousy, of being a joyless observer who couldn't stand to see his brother embrace life. She asked him why he cared, why the Duke of Blackthorn, who had ignored her existence for 3 years, suddenly had such a vested interest in her heart. The question hung between them, heavy and dangerous. Hugh pulled her incrementally closer, his grip tightening as they navigated a complex turn. He didn't deny the jealousy. He didn't retreat behind the walls of his title. Instead, he stripped away the pretense. He admitted that he cared because he was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. He admitted that he couldn't stand to watch her be reduced to an anecdote in Christopher's travel diary. The intimacy of the confession was shattering. It wasn't just a warning about Kit, it was a revelation about Hugh. Beneath the granite exterior there was a furnace of emotion burning so hot it threatened to consume him. He told her with a raw honesty that terrified her that she deserved someone who knew her worth not as a temporary amusement but as a permanent reality. He spoke of a hypothetical man who wouldn't need to be convinced, who wouldn't need time to decide, but who would know instantly and irrevocably that she was the only choice. The music swelled to its crescendo, the violins screaming in harmony with the confusion in Imogen's heart. For a few minutes, amidst the crush of the ballroom, she and Hugh were the only two people in the world, locked in a combat that looked like a dance. She realized, with a sinking sensation in the pit of her stomach, that Hugh was right about the danger, but he was wrong about the source. The danger wasn't that Kit would break her heart by leaving. The danger was that Hugh was breaking down her defenses by staying. He challenged her intellect, he saw her flaws, and he looked at her with a hunger that Kit's sunny affection simply could not match. When the music stopped, the separation was abrupt and jarring. Hugh released her immediately, stepping back behind the barricade of his formal manners, his face once again a mask of impenetrable reserve. He bowed, thanked her for the dance, and walked away without looking back, leaving her standing in the middle of the floor, breathless and trembling. Kit appeared seconds. Later, his face etched with concern, asking if his brother had upset her. Imogen lied. She said it was just a dance. But as she took Kit's arm and allowed him to lead her toward the supper room, she knew that the architecture of her world had fundamentally shifted. She was walking with the man who offered her the world she had always wanted: travel, excitement, escape. But her thoughts were entirely consumed by the man who offered her nothing but the terrifying, unvarnished truth. The waltz was over, but the echo of Hugh's warning and the memory of his hand on her waist lingered like a bruise, a dark mark of possession that no amount of charming conversation could erase. The season had begun with a hope for a match. It was now spiraling into a choice between a dream that might fade and a reality that burned. The London season began to curdle under the weight of an unusually stifling July heatwave. The crisp freshness of spring had long since evaporated, replaced by a heavy, humid blanket that hung over the city, fraying tempers and wilting the starched collars of even the most composed gentlemen. For Imogen, the oppressive weather mirrored the suffocating pressure of her own existence. The euphoric blur of being the season's chosen favourite had begun to thin, revealing the sharp, jagged edges of reality beneath. The gossip, once a thrilling novelty, had turned voracious, demanding a conclusion to the romantic drama that had entertained the ton for months. Everyone expected an engagement announcement. Her father, the Earl, had already begun making discreet inquiries about the cost of a wedding trousseau, his eyes shining with a hopefulness that made Imogen's stomach churn with guilt, because despite the constant presence of Christopher Montlair, despite the flowers and the public displays of affection, the proposal had not come. Subtle fissures had begun to appear in the perfect facade of Kit's courtship. They were microscopic at first, invisible to anyone but Imogen, who had spent a lifetime observing the nuances of human behavior from the shadows. Kit was still charming, still affectionate, and still the most entertaining companion she had ever known. But the tenor of his conversation had shifted. In the early days, he had spoken of we, where we might travel, what we might see. Now, the pronoun had quietly, almost imperceptibly, reverted to I. He spoke with increasing frequency of the grouse season in Scotland, of a long-planned expedition to the Greek Isles, of the call of the open horizon. He spoke of these things not as shared adventures, but as solitary pilgrimages he needed to undertake to find himself, before settling into the yoke of domesticity. It was the restlessness Hugh had predicted, manifesting exactly as the Duke had warned, and the accuracy of that prediction terrified Imogen more than the potential loss of the relationship itself. The tension reached its zenith at the Duchess Georgiana's annual summer garden party, hosted at the palatial Blackthorn house. It was the closing bracket of the social season, a final display of ducal power before the aristocracy retreated to their country estates. The grounds of Blackthorn House were a testament to centuries of wealth and obsession, acres of manicured lawns, hedge mazes that rivaled Hampton Court, and a decorative lake that shimmered like a sheet of hammered silver under the relentless sun. Imogen arrived with her father, stepping out of the carriage into a world that felt designed to intimidate. This was Hugh's world. Every stone, every perfectly pruned rosebush, every footman standing in silent attention spoke of order, permanence, and the crushing weight of legacy, the very things Kit claimed to despise, and the very things Hugh bore on his shoulders like Atlas. Kit found her near the orangery, his golden hair catching the sunlight, looking every inch the storybook prince. He was effusive, complimenting her gown and her smile, but his eyes were darting around the crowded lawn with the frantic energy of a trapped bird looking for an open window. He suggested a walk, guiding her away from the main party, past the string quartet and the tables laden with strawberries and champagne, toward a secluded stone bench overlooking the water. It was a romantic setting, the kind of place where proposals were made, yet the air between them was thick with an impending ending, not a beginning. When they sat, Kit did not take her hand immediately. He stared out at the swans drifting on the lake, his usual easy confidence replaced by a rare struggle for words awkwardness. When he finally spoke, it was with a sincerity that was both touching and devastating. He confessed that the past few months had been the happiest of his season, that she was extraordinary, and that he cared for her deeply. But then came the conjunction that Imogen had been dreading. But he was not ready. He confessed that the prospect of marriage, of permanence, felt like a cage door swinging shut. He was 26, he argued, and there was so much of the world he had yet to taste. He needed to go to Scotland. He needed to go to Greece. He needed to be Christopher Montlair, the adventurer, a little while. Longer before he could be Christopher Montlair, the husband. He was asking for time. He wasn't breaking the courtship, he insisted. He was merely pressing pause. He wanted her to wait. He wanted to leave her in London, suspended in amber, while he chased the horizon, promising to return when he had satisfied his wanderlust. It was a soft rejection, wrapped in the cotton wool of affection and vague promises, but it was a rejection nonetheless. Imogen sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over her. It was the calm of validation. Hugh had been right. Every brutal word the Duke had spoken during their waltz had been a prophecy. Kit was not cruel, but he was careless. He was asking her to be a harbour he could return to when the seas got rough, not a partner to sail with. She released him. With a quiet dignity that seemed to surprise him, Imogen told him she understood. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply accepted the truth he was offering, that he was a boy playing at love, while she was a woman looking for a life. The relief on Kit's face was instantaneous and undisguised. He kissed her hands, calling her the most understanding woman in England, his gratitude bubbling over because she had made the messy business of letting her down easy for him. He was so relieved, so eager to escape the awkwardness of the moment that he barely registered the sound of heavy footsteps crushing the gravel path behind them. Hugh Montlair did not emerge from the hedge maze. He erupted from it. He stood at the edge of the clearing, a dark silhouette against the bright greenery. radiating a fury so palpable it seemed to drop the ambient temperature by 10 degrees. He had been watching. Of course, he had been watching. He had likely been tracking their movements since they arrived, his protective instincts, or perhaps his possessive ones, on high alert. He looked from his brother's relieved face to Imogen's pale, composed features, and the deduction was instantaneous. The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. Hugh did not shout. He didn't need to. He simply dismissed his brother. He ordered Kit to return to the house, to their mother, to anywhere that wasn't here. There was a tone of command in his voice that brooked no argument, the voice of the patriarch, the Duke. Kit, perhaps sensing that he had escaped a much worse fate by Imogen's grace, and perhaps feeling the sting of his own cowardice, did not fight. He offered Imogen one last apologetic look, and then he fled, retreating toward the safety of the crowded lawn, leaving the woman he had courted alone with the brother who had warned her against him. Imogen remained on the bench, refusing to look up, refusing to let Hugh see the humiliation that was finally beginning to burn behind her eyes. She expected an "I told you so." She expected the cold satisfaction of a man proved right. But when Hugh moved, it was not to loom over her in triumph. He sat beside her, close enough that his coat brushed her arm, invading her space with a deliberate, overwhelming presence. He didn't speak of Kit. He didn't mention Scotland or Greece. He asked with a quiet intensity that shattered her composure why she had let him do it, why she had let Christopher treat her heart like a temporary lodging. Imogen turned to him then, anger flaring bright and hot, a defense mechanism against the pain. She asked what he would have had her do: beg, plead, force a man to marry her who clearly viewed her as a constraint. She told Hugh that she had dignity, even if she lacked his brother's adventurous spirit. Hugh's reaction was not what she expected. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before dropping to grip the back of the bench, as if physically restraining himself from touching her. He told her that dignity was cold comfort in a lonely bed. He told her that she was looking at the world through a mirror that distorted her value. He leaned in, his grey eyes burning with a desperate, raw honesty that stripped the moment of all social pretense. He told her that she was making a mistake, not by releasing Kit, but by believing that what Kit offered was the best she could hope for. Then came the words that would rewrite her history. Hugh's voice dropped to a rough whisper, vibrating with months of suppressed longing. He told her she had been looking at the wrong brother. It wasn't a flirtatious remark. It was a confession wrung from a man at the end of his endurance. He told her that, while Kit saw a pleasant companion for sunny days, he, Hugh, saw the storm, and he loved the storm. He admitted to watching her, to memorizing her, to agonizing over every smile she bestowed on Christopher, knowing that Christopher didn't understand the value of the currency he was spending. He told her that a man who knew her worth wouldn't need a summer in Scotland to decide if he wanted her. He would know the moment she walked into the room. He would know that freedom meant nothing if it meant being without her. The declaration hung in the humid air, heavy and intoxicating. Imogen stared at him, her breath caught in her lungs. This was the Duke of Blackthorn, the rigid, cold, terrifying man, laying his pride at her feet. He wasn't offering her a fun season. He was offering her a devastating, all-consuming certainty. He was telling her that he, the man who never wanted anything, wanted her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The chemistry she had felt, the tension, the arguments, it hadn't been animosity. It had been the friction of two souls recognizing each other before their minds had caught up. But before she could answer, before she could even process the magnitude of what he was offering, voices drifted over the hedge, guests approaching, laughter, the mundane world intruding on this shattered moment of intimacy. Hugh pulled back instantly, the mask of the Duke sliding back into place with practiced ease, though his eyes remained wild. He stood up, towering over her once more. He didn't ask for an answer. He didn't press his advantage. He simply told her to think about what he had said. He told her that Kit was leaving for Scotland in the morning, and that she had a choice to make, not between two men, but between a fantasy that would always leave her waiting and a reality that would never let her go. He turned and walked away, his stride long and angry, disappearing into the maze as quickly as he had appeared. Imogen was left alone on the stone bench, the sound of the swans gliding on the water, the only noise in the sudden, ringing silence. The sun was still shining, the party was still roaring in the distance, but the world had irrevocably changed. Kit was leaving. The courtship was effectively over, and she was left with the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that the wrong brother might have been the right one all along. As she stood to return to the house, her legs trembling, Imogen realized that the season was over, but the real story, the dangerous one, had only just begun. The weeks following the garden party transformed Imogen's quiet existence into a study of absence. Christopher Montlair had departed for Scotland as promised, leaving a void in London society that was quickly filled by the arrival of his letters. They came with clockwork regularity, heavy parchment envelopes stamped with postmarks from the Highlands, filled with charming anecdotes about grouse shooting, damp weather, and the eccentrics he encountered in country inns. They were perfect letters, witty, affectionate, and entertaining, yet, as Imogen read them in the quiet of her morning room, she felt a profound hollowness. Kit's words described a life of movement and surface-level joy, but they contained no questions about her, no urgency, and no future. He was writing to an audience, not a partner. However, the more palpable absence was that of the Duke of Blackthorn. Since his explosive confession in the garden, Hugh Montlair had retreated behind a fortress of absolute propriety. He continued to attend necessary social functions, but he had become a distant satellite, orbiting the periphery of Imogen's life without ever entering its atmosphere. He never approached her, he never danced with her, he scrupulously avoided eye contact, but Imogen felt him. She felt his presence like a change in air pressure before a storm. In the absence of Kit's constant chatter, she discovered the terrifying truth that Hugh had predicted. She did not miss the charm. She missed the gravity. She missed the way Hugh challenged her, the way he looked at her as if she were a riddle he was desperate to solve. The realization crystallized one evening at the theatre. From the Carlisle box, Imogen watched the performance, but her attention was magnetically drawn to the Blackthorn box across the auditorium. Hugh sat in the shadows, his profile stark and unyielding. During a scene of particular heartbreak on stage, he turned. Across the crowded expanse of the theatre, their eyes met. It lasted only a second, but in that brief connection, the polite fiction of their estrangement shattered. Imogen saw the raw hunger he was fighting to suppress. She saw the loneliness he wore like armor. In that moment, the confusion of the summer evaporated. She realized she'd been courted by a boy who wanted a playmate, while a man who wanted a soulmate stood watching her from the dark. The resolution to this suspended state arrived with the end of summer. A formal invitation to dine at Blackthorn House was delivered, a small, intimate gathering to mark Christopher's return from Scotland before his likely departure for Greece. It was the deadline Imogen had been waiting for. She dressed for the evening with the precision of a woman preparing for battle, choosing emerald silk that armored her in confidence. Her father, oblivious to the undercurrents, chattered happily about the potential for an engagement announcement, but Imogen sat in the carriage in silence, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The dinner was a masterclass in tension. Kit, tanned and windswept from his travels, was radiant with energy, monopolizing the conversation with tales of his exploits. He seemed genuinely delighted to see Imogen, treating her with the warm familiarity of an old friend, completely unaware that the ground beneath him had shifted. Hugh sat at the head of the table, a silent sentinel. He looked exhausted, his features drawn, barely touching his wine. Every time Kit laughed or touched Imogen's hand in casual affection, Hugh's jaw tightened, a microscopic betray of the fury consuming him. The Duchess Georgiana presided over the table with an enigmatic smile, her sharp eyes darting between her sons and their guest, watching the pressure build with the patience of a chemist waiting for a reaction. When the meal concluded, the party moved to the music room, but Kit almost immediately drew Imogen aside. He asked to walk with her in the conservatory, claiming he needed to speak with her away from the others. The moment had come. As they walked among the shadows of exotic palms and night-blooming jasmine, the air heavy with humidity and scent, Kit led her to a bench and took her hands. He looked earnest, affectionate, and undeniably relieved. He began to speak of his time away, of how the distance had given him clarity. He told her that he cared for her immensely, that she was wonderful, but that he had realized he was not ready to be the man she deserved. He spoke of his need for freedom, for the open road, admitting that settling down now would only lead to resentment. He was breaking her heart gently, or so he thought. He was offering her a soft exit, framing his inability to commit as a noble sacrifice. Imogen listened, and to her own surprise, she felt only a profound sense of release. She didn't feel the sting of rejection. She felt the weight of expectation lifting. When Kit finished, looking at her with anxious blue eyes, waiting for tears or recriminations, Imogen simply smiled. She thanked him for his honesty. She told him he was right. The relief that washed over Kit was comical in its intensity. He kissed her hands, praising her understanding, calling her extraordinary. Then, with a perceptiveness he rarely displayed, Kit paused. He looked at her, really looked at her, and then he looked back toward the house where the library light glowed. He asked with a sudden, sheepish grin if she had noticed his brother. He admitted he would have to be blind not to see it, the way Hugh looked at her, the way he had been miserable for months. Kit laughed, a sound free of malice, and told her that he had stepped aside, not just for his own freedom, but because he suspected the better man was waiting in the other room. He gave her his blessing, not that she needed it, and told her to go to him. "Put him out of his misery," Kit said, "before he broods himself into a statue." Imogen left him in the conservatory and walked back through the house, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. She did not return to the drawing room. She went straight to the library. The heavy oak door was a formidable barrier, but she pushed it open without knocking. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the dying embers of the fire and a single lamp. Hugh was there, standing by the mantelpiece, staring into the flames. He looked like a man who had reached the end of his endurance. He turned sharply at her entrance, his expression shifting from misery to shock. He asked where Christopher was. Imogen closed the door, sealing them in. She told him Kit was in the conservatory, happy and relieved to be free. She stepped further into the room, invading the sanctuary Hugh had built for himself. She saw the hope flare in his eyes, warring with disbelief. She didn't wait for him to ask. She told him he had been right. She admitted that she had spent the season looking at the sunlight and ignoring the gravity, but that the season was over. She told him she didn't want a travel companion. She wanted a partner. She wanted the man who saw her, who challenged her, who had terrified her with the intensity of his regard. Hugh stood frozen, as if afraid that moving would shatter the illusion. He asked her to be certain. He warned her again that he was difficult, serious and possessive, that a life with him would not be a charming adventure. but a serious commitment. Imogen crossed the final distance between them. She reached out and took his hands, hands that were trembling slightly. She told him she didn't want easy. She chose him. The control Hugh had maintained for months snapped. He pulled her to him, not with the polite distance of the ballroom, but with a desperate, claiming force. His kiss was not a question. It was an answer to every doubt she had ever harbored. It was an outpouring of months of suppressed longing, a vow made against her lips. In the silence of the library, with the fire crackling beside them, the wallflower and the Duke finally aligned. They were interrupted not by scandal, but by applause. The Duchess Georgiana stood in the doorway, beaming with satisfaction, having orchestrated the entire evening for this precise outcome. She declared it about time and immediately began discussing wedding dates, ignoring her son's groaned protest at the interruption. 2 years later, the sun shone brightly over the manicured lawns of Blackthorn Abbey, but the atmosphere was no longer one of intimidation. It was alive with the sound of music and laughter. A grand ball was in full swing, the first hosted by the Duchess Imogen. She stood on the terrace, watching the guests, no longer hiding behind a potted palm, but radiating the quiet confidence of a woman who knows exactly where she belongs. She held a letter in her hand, a missive from Egypt, where Kit was happily excavating ruins and sending sketches of camels. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Hugh rested his chin on her shoulder, his presence warm and solid. He asked if she was regretting her choice, teasing her as he often did now, his seriousness tempered by the joy of their life together. Imogen leaned back against him, looking out at the life they had built, the estate she managed, the friends they welcomed, and the nursemaid. Walking across the lawn with a toddler who had Hugh's dark hair and Imogen's eyes, she turned in his arms, looking up into the grey eyes that had once terrified her, and now held her entire world. She told him she had no regrets. She had flirted with the wrong brother to find the right man, and as Hugh kissed her under the summer sky, surrounded by the evidence of their shared happiness, Imogen knew that the wallflower had not just been picked, she had bloomed. The end.